Hey guys, we are back with another season power ranking for Survivor. This time for Survivor David versus Goliath. Now, if you aren't familiar with this video type, basically what I did was I went through the entire season of David versus Goliath and did an episode by episode power ranking, basically as a way of simulating how I would have covered the season had this channel been around at the time the season was airing, looking at these people's edits, and determining who I felt like would have been the contenders at various points throughout the season. So basically, I'm like going through each of the players in their boot order and talking about how my thoughts on them changed over the course of the season, at least from an edgic perspective. But we had 20 players to talk about, and as we waste no more time, let's get right into the video. So first up, we have the first boot of the season in Pat Cusack. And I feel like he got a pretty standard edit from what you would expect from someone like him, where he got a pretty big edit for the most part, where we really get to see him exemplifying the David tribe. He also gets a lot of focus in terms of building the shelter. And considering how big his edit is, and considering the fact that he was a potential target had they gone to the first tribal, I do feel like his edit here is pretty positive, all things considered, where even though it could have been a lot more negative had he actually been voted out, I do feel like he does get propped up to a degree. Now, granted, we do still get people talking about how they don't like his style, but we also get plenty of focus from people like Jessica about how like he was the one to build a shelter, and we even see on his way out people talking pretty positively about him, considering the way that he gets taken out with him being medevac here. So again, I feel like he got a pretty standard edit for first boot, where he got a pretty massive edit explaining his downfall, really trying to get as much as they could out of him within this one episode, but also pretty positive considering he wasn't actually voted out, but rather pulled from the game. Next up, we had Jessica, who got a pretty interesting edit considering she was the second boot, or I guess the first boot if we are looking at people being voted out, as she does get content in the premiere talking about how she's only 19, but she is telling people that she's 22. She also gets personal content talking about her mom and how she was in a bunch of bad relationships and that she has to be strong for her. They also feel like Nick overshadows her within that scene. And she also gets to prop up Pat on his way out, talking about how he built a shelter and that they were grateful for his presence there. So again, a pretty prominent premiere, but I also feel like there's definitely some undermining there where she talks about how she was lying about her age so that people don't think that she's strong enough, but then we literally see her getting emotional not only when she was giving her personal content, but also at the end of the episode after Pat gets medevac, which is obviously understandable, but I also feel like it sort of leaves some weird messages there. And then episode 2 clearly sets up her boot where she gets a confessional right at the beginning, talking about how Bat was the morale booster for their tribe, and then doesn't get anything again until after the immunity challenge, where she talks about her and B targeting Lyrsa. And considering that Elizabeth was getting the bulk of the content for putting the target on Jessica's back, which we'll be talking about more when we get to Elizabeth, I did feel like Elizabeth was more primed to get her way there and taking out Jessica. So to that end, it makes sense why Jessica has a relatively early boot. Next up, we have Jeremy, who also gets a pretty strange edit here, where in the premiere, the bulk of his content is about him talking about how Mike has his target on his back due to him being on The Amazing Race and being a screenwriter. Also, when Mike goes idol hunting, which is all pretty strange considering we later see Jeremy and Mike having this good relationship, and the fact that neither of them really get to prop up that relationship is probably a bad sign. But then we get to episode 2 where we see him finding Dan's idol in his jacket and also his rivalry with Natalie starting to form. And then we get to his boot episode, which is really just a massive downfall episode for him, where he does get personal content early on talking about his father having early Alzheimer's. And he does talk a bit about his relationship with Mike, only for him to later dig his own grave by overplaying, telling people to not have game talks. You also have him having arguments with Natalie, and all this just sets up Jeremy's downfall pretty clearly, so it makes sense why he ends up going out here this early. Next up, we have B, who ends up having a pretty quiet edit here, which makes sense considering she does end up quitting the game, and obviously through that she was never really a contender. Though at the same time, I feel like she definitely gets some positivity there, like in episode 1 where she's shown comforting Jessica by talking about how she's an advocate for women and that she's an MMA fighter. We then get to episode 2 where she does give the tribe a pep talk after losing the challenge, so that leads right into them targeting Lyrsa for being a challenge weakness. And then we get to episode 3, which is essentially a visibility spike for her, where she talks about feeling blindsided and that she's going to start playing the game more. We do see her trying to pin the target onto Gabby, though doesn't get too much progress there. And then obviously she gets a confessional right after the immunity challenge explaining her injury, how she tore her MCL before the game, which is clearly there to set up her eventual quit at the very beginning of episode 4. And I feel like her quit scene is kind of strange, where it does feel a bit out of nowhere. It feels like they're just getting it out of the way, and it doesn't really feel that earned. So it does feel a bit strange how they present that on the show. But obviously, considering her content, it never really felt like she was much of a contender, which makes sense considering her circumstances. Next up, we have Natalia, and Natalia was someone I was very low on for pretty much her entire run, where I feel like her premiere was pretty lackluster, where her only real content is talking about how she wants to target Natalie for being super bossy, which doesn't feel very complex there. Episode 2 is a bit better, where she gets some strategic content, namely with her alliance with Angelina and Kara, and she does move up a bit on the rankings because of that. But then episode 3 is pretty bad, where she continues to want Natalie gone, and she doesn't care that people want to keep Natalie around for the long term, given she is this clear target, which is obviously pretty bad and makes her come off as this pretty rash player. And considering she doesn't even vote out Natalie at that tribal is also a pretty bad look, to where I did have her towards the bottom of the ranking going to the swap. And then her boot episode's pretty bad, where she does seem to be a bit antsy, and the fact that she talks so much about need to break up Elizabeth and Kara just felt like it was setting up her boot by the end of it. So again, I feel like Natalia's edit is mostly bad, and I feel like the fact that she goes out in the pre-merge makes a lot of sense. Next up, we have Natalie, who is obviously a fantastic character, and she was obviously never winning. She was a pretty big character right from the offset, mostly negative content. Now, I will say she wasn't at the very bottom after the premiere, where despite her coming off as this pretty big personality right at the bat, I do feel like there were other people that got quieter edits compared to her, and I felt like there was a bit of a chance she could have made it a little bit into the game before eventually being taken out. And that's largely what ends up happening here. Really, by episode 3, like, it's already pretty apparent that she is on the bottom. And while she does survive that Jeremy vote, we get continued focused about how bossy she is. And really, by the end of it, it makes sense why she eventually gets taken out. Next up, we have Lyrsa, and I was actually pretty high on Lyrsa after the premiere, where we got some focus on her relationship with Elizabeth, and considering that I was also high on Elizabeth, which we'll begin into in a moment, I did feel like that kind of rubbed off on Lyrsa as well. Now, I will say episode 2 did start this downward trajectory where she was being targeted due to her being this challenge weakness, and while I felt like she was going to stay, especially when Elizabeth was getting all this credit for shifting the target onto Jessica, she's then quiet for the next 2 episodes, getting 0 confessionals in episodes 3 and 4, causing her to slide down further. And then by the swap, she is like kind of on the bottom, where she does talk about being annoyed by Natalie in episode 5. And then in episode 6, she does get plenty of content setting up her eventual boot. So in a lot of ways, I did feel like Lyrsa was someone I was pretty high on initially, though it didn't take too long for me to cool off on her. Next up, we have Elizabeth, who has a very strange trajectory on the season, as she was actually my frontrunner for the first 2 episodes of the season, which feels strange on the surface, but she actually gets pretty solid content in her premiere, where she gets a confessional during the intro talking about how she comes from this big family. She also gets her set up relationship with Lyrsa. She also gets to really exemplify the David tribe, to where after Pat gets medevac, she does get the final confessional of that episode, talking about how this shows how the Davids are on the bottom and really showing how that theme is playing out, which did feel like pretty solid content there. And then episode 2, she gets the bulk of the credit for the Jessica plan saving Lyrsa there. And then episode 3, she gets a cooldown episode where she doesn't get any confessionals there, which didn't feel particularly egregious at the time. So really through the first 3 episodes, I was actually pretty high on Elizabeth, but I feel like it's after the swap that her edit starts to go a bit downhill, where in episode 4, she is targeted due to her relationship with Kara, and while she is like able to get out of that, I feel like other people had stronger episodes compared to her. Episode 5 is mostly whatever, where she mostly gets some content about pulling at Alec after the Goliath get the numbers. But then episode 6 is where things really go downhill, where she does get mostly negative content, where she is complaining about the shelter due to her back injury. And while you could see this as her getting personal content, we also see the likes of Carl going down particularly hard on her there. And I felt like it made her come off as pretty emotional, at least based off the show. And then her merge episode, again, is mostly bad, where she is targeted once again. And we do see her getting pretty emotional after finding out that she is the target. And she like tries to like pull it all together, but by that point it's pretty obvious that she is going home. So really it's a bit of an interesting case where she was getting decent content early on, And I felt like it was with the lack of other strong contenders, I kind of left her this high on the list, at least during a lot of the pre-merge. But I feel like by episode 5, it became pretty clear that she was not winning. And then her final 2 episodes were pretty bad, to where her going out the merge doesn't come off as that big of a shock. Next up, we have John Hennigan, who also has a very strange edit on the season, and I straight up didn't know what to do with him on the power rankings here. Now, his premiere is pretty solid, where he does get a match chat at the beginning, getting to introduce himself as a pro wrestler. He also gets a setup storyline to him being underestimated and how he's playing this game as John as opposed to the mayor of Slamtown. And again, it was all pretty good. I had him at number 2 after the premiere. But then we get to episode 2, where he does focus his relationship on Natalie and how he talks about how this will be the secret alliance, only for it to immediately fall apart, where he does tell Natalie that her name is being thrown out, only for her to go on this rampage, going at the people and asking why she's being targeted, and then him acknowledging that it was a bad decision there, which is not a particularly good look for John. But I feel like he rebounds in episode 3, where he does talk about playing as John and that he's getting better at his social skills, and we do see him bonding with people. Though at the same time, you could interpret that as a journey edit, but still it was enough to bounce him back up. After the swap, we see him bonding with Christian and how he relates to Christian a lot and pulling him in as a brochacho. And while he's pretty quiet in episodes 5 and 6, I felt like it was enough to where he would remain relatively high on the rankings, as I felt like he wasn't being overexposed. And he was even number 1 coming to the merge, which does feel a bit strange, though when we get to other people later on, I do feel like it makes a bit more sense in context. Now, he does drop a bit after the merge episode, where he is present and he does talk about sticking with the Goliath, though at the same time, I feel like other people have better merge episodes than him. And then we get to his boot episode, where his only content comes right after the immunity challenge. He gets a confessional about how taking out Christian will be a hashtag brochacho blindside, which felt like it was there just to set up his eventual boot, where he gets just enough content to where he's not completely invisible, but at the same time, it makes sense why he's eventually taken out in such a shocking way with the minority vote split. So again, it is a pretty strange edit for John, and again, considering his post-swap, he's pretty high. I wasn't entirely sure if that was warranted, considering how strange his edit would go up and down, but I feel like it makes sense considering he is taken out in this pretty big blindside, to where it did feel like he was being set up as this decoy winner during the first half of the season, and is obviously meant to be propped up so that his eventual blindside is seen as his pretty monumental move, which to be fair it is, but I do find his edit here pretty confusing nonetheless. Next up, we have Dan, and his edit is kind of a train wreck. Now, his premiere is actually pretty good, where he gets plenty of personal content talking about how he used to be a fat kid, but got into shape. He also gets set up to his showmance with Kara, which at least in episode 1 is presented pretty positively. It's not until later on that he gets undermined for this. And then you also have him finding the idol, which is presented in a pretty unconventional way, where he does find it off screen, and we do see everyone else looking for it before we know that Dan has it, only for Dan to come out and say, all these people don't know that I already have it, which was pretty unique there and definitely made him look pretty good, to where I actually had him at number 3 after the premiere, but I think it all goes downhill pretty quickly, where in episode 2, he has him hiding the idol in his jacket, thinking no one will find it, only for Jeremy to find it, which is not a particularly good look. You also have his showmance with Kara starting to put a target on their backs, which isn't particularly good, and I think it becomes increasingly apparent that Dan's showmance with Kara is not really being taken that seriously, and Dan himself comes off as this pretty lovesick puppy, which I think really harms his chances of winning. And while he remains in a good spot after the swap, I do feel like he gets undermined a bit more, where we do see him talking about Gabby being on the bottom, while Gabby calls him a pretty big threat and pretty cocky, and that really sinks his chances of winning, to where coming to the merge, he is probably one of the bottom place people to actually win the game, at least in my estimation. And I feel like the merge episode only further sinks his chances, where not only is he being targeted by Elizabeth in this episode, but we also get this Strike Force alliance that talks about taking down a Goliath at some point, and with Dan himself coming off as his pretty stereotypical Goliath and someone who is pretty committed to working with the Goliath alliance, I think it very blatantly sets up his downfall, to where even though Elizabeth goes out in that particular episode, I think it's pretty clear that Dan himself is being set up for a downfall, and that eventually culminates in his boot episode, where he obviously plays the idol only for it to be nullified. So really, I feel like Dan is someone who, while he had a good premiere and he seemed like a promising prospect early on, I feel like it very quickly goes downhill, and by the merge, it makes sense why he eventually gets taken out. Next up, we have Alec Merlino, who, despite being a big player in the season and a future star on The White Lotus, was never a serious contender at any point, where I feel like his pre-merge for the most part is pretty quiet, and he was actually at the very bottom of the power ranking after the premiere because he got the quietest edit there, which I feel like was pretty bad. He does get a bit of content in episode 2, but again, mostly quiet. Episode 3, he's completely invisible there. And it's not until episode 4, the swap episode, that he does get a visibility spike, but that was circumstantial as he was the swing vote at that tribal to take out Natalia. And while we get plenty of his perspective on the game there, he drops right back down in episode 5, where he gets almost no follow-up to his decision to take out Natalia, and even gets negativity from people like Kara, who felt betrayed by his decision to flip, which I feel like was a pretty bad look there. And he's pretty quiet for the rest of the pre-merge. He does pick right back up at the merge, where from that point on, he does get a pretty big edit, having a pretty massive merge episode, which does elevate him slightly, but considering how quiet his pre-merge was, I felt like he was never truly a contender there. And we do see him navigating the game, like him building the Strike Force Alliance along with Mike and Allison. Episode 8, he is the one to tell Nick about the plan to take out Christian, which eventually leads to the minority vote split. And we get plenty of his perspective with him playing the middle between the Goliath Alliance and this David/Goliath Alliance. But considering how quiet his pre-merge was, I never felt like he was truly a contender. And even then, his episode 9 is not particularly great, where he talks about wanting to vote for Christian and remain Goliath strong, only to vote instead with the David side of things and splitting the vote on Angelina and Dan, which I feel like was a pretty bad look. And then his boot episode propped him up as a pretty big threat. I felt like it was pretty apparent he was going home by that point. So really, I feel like Alec is a pretty interesting case here of someone who definitely was a big player on the season, but considering how quiet his pre-merge was, I felt like he never really had a shot at winning, and I felt like he was only getting content when it was absolutely necessary for him to be shown, so it makes sense why he eventually goes on to lose. Next up, we have Carl, who has a pretty strange edit as well, and I wasn't really sure what to do with him either on these power rankings. Now, early on, he does have a pretty notable premiere where he does get some setup early on to working with Jessica, how he sees her as his daughter, but then we never see them really interacting or building a game relationship, which I found pretty strange. He also talks pretty negatively about Pat being over the top, talks negatively about Nick for not working at camp, and by the end, I was mostly middle of the road on him for his premiere. Episode 2, he does get some focus about him focusing on challenge strength and wanting to target Lyrsa, only to be blindsided there when Jessica goes home instead. But I feel like he recovers a bit in episode 3, where we do see his reaction to the Jessica blindside, and we get some setup to him being an underdog figure, which is decent content, especially when he eventually stays at the end of the episode. Episode 4 is also a big episode for him, and while a lot of it's circumstantial since he is on exile, he does end up finding the idol nullifier and compares it to the slingshot that took out Goliath, which I felt like was pretty interesting setup to that eventual usage. And while his episode 5 is pretty quiet, we then get episode 6 where he sets up his rivalry with Elizabeth. And while I don't think it's necessarily a great look for either of them, I do think it's a better look for Carl, and considering he does end up winning the battle against Elizabeth, I feel like that was enough to have him a little bit higher on the list. But then we get to the merge, where I did elevate him on the power ranking after the merge episode, where he does get the confessional about how the merge is when you start playing for yourself, and he does win the battle against Elizabeth, which I feel like was pretty good for him to where he was number 3 there. And I feel like for the next couple of episodes afterwards, he is kind of lumped in with the likes of Nick and Davey when they're taking down the Goliath. Mind you, I feel like he's the least prominent of those 3, which I feel like is a knock against his edit, with episode 9 in particular being pretty bad considering he gets 0 confessionals despite playing the idol nullifier against Dan, which I feel like is a missed opportunity there. And then his boot episode has a pretty blatant downfall edit for him where he is presented as his mob boss, literally drunk with power, just spilling information left and right, and it makes sense why he's eventually taken out there. But I do find Carl's edit here to be pretty confusing, where I feel like there are definitely points where he gets positivity and he does get personal content there, but I feel like there is just enough missed opportunities and just enough inconsistency with his edit to where he was very rarely a contender for a lot of it, but still someone that was set up for a deep run. Next up, we have Gabby, whose edit is also a bit of a train wreck here. Now, I actually think she had a solid premiere. She gets a mad chat there, gets to introduce herself as a technical writer. We also get her bond with Christian being clearly established from the start. And she also gets a confessional after Pat is medevac, talking about how it's a big loss for their tribe. So again, I actually feel like her premiere was pretty solid, and she was relatively high on the power ranking afterwards. Episode 2 is a bit wonky, where even though she gets her way in taking out Jessica over Lyrsa, we also have Christian talking about how he has to reassure Gabby and that Gabby's begging him to make the vote go her way, which I do feel like is a pretty questionable look, but still she does get her way at that vote. But I feel like episode 3 is where things start to fall off the rails, where we do see people blaming her for the Jessica vote, namely B and Davey, which I feel like knocks her on the power ranking there. We then get to the swap where she continues to spiral, where we do see her being on the bottom of her swap tribe, and a lot of her content is her getting pretty emotional about it, talking about how Christian's so much better than her at pretty much everything, how she's overshadowed by Christian. And I feel like even though you can chalk this up to Gabby being Gabby, I feel like if she were the winner of the season, they wouldn't be showing her this much, being this emotional on the show. I feel like they would be doing more to shield her, or at least showing her trying to get off the bottom a bit more. But I feel like this content is mainly here to foreshadow Gabby eventually turning on Christian while completely sinking her own chances of winning. And while she partially rectifies this in episode 6 with her doing a bit more game talks, I feel like by then her chances are pretty much shot, and I pretty much written her off as a contender. We then get to the merge where her content is mostly bad, where at the merge feed she talks about how there usually is an idle clue only for her to not see one, and she's later contradicted in the following episode where it turns out that there was a clue at the merge feed, she just didn't see it. And even beyond that, she also talks about how the Goliaths are just being cocky and just being the bullies in control of things, and she's just kind of this helpless sacrificial lamb there. Episode 8, the John Hennigan blindside, she's completely invisible, and granted she probably didn't have much to do with that plan anyway, but still, no input there. Episode 9 is where we finally see her relationship with Allison being featured, but the fact that it only took until episode 9 to get it, and even then, it's largely because it had to be there, is a pretty bad sign. Episode 10, she gets a lot of content setting up her flipping against Carl due to Carl being this domineering figure. And then in episode 11, her boot episode, we do see her trying to flip the game against Christian only for it to backfire. So again, I feel like Gabby's edit is one that she had a solid premiere, I'll give her that, but I feel like everything else after that was just a downward spiral, and by the merge, she was pretty much dead in the edit, never really saw her as a contender, but obviously she was at least a major character during key points in the season. Now moving on to Christian, and Christian was also kind of hard to put on this ranking, as I feel like it was very apparent early on that he was the big character of the season, the fan favorite type that would get a massive edit on the show, but very rarely wins the season. And I recognized that early on, however, it still led to some pretty wonky placements, at least at the beginning. Now again, massive premiere, gets a lot of content there. He actually gets the first confessional of the season, and that led to him being pretty high in the ranking. He also gets his relationship with Gabby established. So again, I feel like there's a lot to like there. Episode 2 is also pretty prominent for him, where we see his relationship with Nick get established, the Mason-Dixon line, and he gets a lot of perspective in the lead up to the actual tribal, where he talks about the Mason-Dixon line as being the swing votes there to eventually take out Jessica. And then episode 3 is kind of a cool down episode for him, where his only content is him talking about how he's fascinated by John Hennigan of all people in Slamtown. And he was actually number 1 after episode 3, which is kind of mind-blowing considering the role that he fills on this season. And I feel like it was largely a byproduct of me being uncertain about certain other contenders that we'll be getting to soon enough, as I feel like even with Christian, he was a massive character, and it was just a question over when was the right time to drop him. But I do feel like the swap is where it does make sense to drop him a bit, where even though he gets plenty of content on his swap tribe connecting with the guys and John Hennigan, this is also where we start to see Gabby talking about how charming he is and how he's so much better than her at everything. And I feel like from that point on, it became pretty apparent that he was going to be betrayed at some point. It was just a question of when. But still, he remains in the top half, largely because he is one of the more consistent presences on the show. We then get to the merge, where we do see him reconnecting with Nick and talking about the Mason-Dixon once again, and we also see him being a part of the Strike Force Alliance that forms. He even names it the Strike Force Alliance, but it's also not too long before his threat level becomes pretty apparent, where we do see in the merge episode Angelina talking about potentially voting him out, only for the Goliath to not do so. And then the very next episode, we do see Mike trying to blindside him, and we even see Christian talking about how this vote will be a test for the Strike Force Alliance, only for it to fail right away. But at the same time, I don't feel like Christian gets that much content in terms of actually saying of himself, considering it is more the work of Nick and Davey that really allows him to stay in that round. But still, it's pretty apparent by that point that he's a big threat, and that there's just no way he's just going to get all the way to the end without being targeted again. Episode 9 is kind of whatever, where we do see him finding an idol, getting through the Dan vote. But then we have episode 10, which is pretty big for him, where he does get a pretty massive scene during the first reward, where he narrates the whole scene about getting letters from home and being underestimated, which leads in him winning the immunity challenge against Alec. And we get content of him talking about how voting out Alec would just make him a bigger target down the road, only for him to do so anyway. And then we get to the following round, where he and Gabby are in lockstep working to take out Carl, and he does get propped up for that to a degree. But then we get to the very next episode, where Gabby turns on him, as Gabby wants to play her own game and wants to take out Christian for being this big threat. And while he does survive that vote, taking out Gabby instead, he is then targeted the next round, where he actually doesn't get that much to do in his eventual boot episode, which I think is partially an admission that at that point his goose was pretty much cooked and there really wasn't much of a way out of the situation. But still, Christian did have a pretty massive edit across the season. He was definitely one of the biggest characters of the season, but also one that was kind of hard to rank, considering that it was pretty apparent that he was going to be taken out down the road, despite him having plenty of longevity on the season. So it was definitely interesting to assess Christian's edit here. Next up, we have Davey, who you would think would be a contender, considering he is remembered as one of the better characters of the season. But his actual edit is relatively quiet, all things considered, especially early on, where his premiere is mostly quiet. His only content comes when he catches the octopus, and even then, that comes relatively late in the episode, which kind of harms his chances, but still, he's around the middle of the pack. Episode 2 is more the same, where his only content is him finding the idol, and while he has pretty fun narration along the way, it felt like it had to be there, and even then, you can argue that he was being shielded due to him losing out on the vote to take out Jessica. But then we get to episode 3, which also isn't great, as he ends up falling into Christian and Nick's trap of believing that Gabby was the one behind the Jessica vote, which is not particularly great. And it's really not until the swap that he has more to do, where during the swap episode, we do see him giving his perspective on the eventual Natalia vote, where he and Elizabeth are initially on the bottom of that tribe, but eventually get their way there. But after that, he's under the radar for the next couple of episodes, and he's completely invisible during the merge episode, which is a pretty big red flag for his edit, where normally the merge episode is a pretty prominent episode for the eventual winner. So for him to not get anything in the merge episode is not particularly great. But he picks right back up in the following episode, where at that point he's working with Nick and Carl. He ends up working with them on the eventual John Hennigan vote, and all that's pretty good as he is lumped in with that group. And we even get a fun confessional from him at the beginning of the following episode, where he does end up taking down the mayor of Slaytown, and he got his jacket too. But at the same time, sort of similar with Carl, I feel like Nick is very clearly the front runner of those three. So I don't really know how much to praise Davey for that on the power ranking. And while he is a somewhat notable character from that point on the season, I feel like I can't really have him that high in the power ranking due to the fact that his pre-merge was relatively quiet and his merge episode was also pretty bad. So it's sort of hard to have him as a top contender, even though he has some fun confessionals along the way. Not to mention his episode 12, where he ends up falling for Nick's plan of planning a fake idol, which causes him to target Nick for a lot of that episode, only to later back off, which I feel like doesn't really factor too much into things, as I feel like his fate was pretty much sealed by that point, but still worth mentioning. So again, I feel like Davey is a fun character in the post-merge, but I feel like before that, he's kind of just under the radar to middle of the road in his actual edit. Next, we have Allison, and Allison was never really a contender, which kind of makes sense considering her edit, where I feel like she's mostly under the radar early on. She does get a mat chat, but even then, it's kind of a bad one, considering it's used to show how the Goliaths are privileged, while people like Pat never got the same opportunities as her. So again, not really sure what to make of that. And from that point on, she's mostly invisible, where episode 2, zero confessionals. Episode 3 says that Natalie's going home, only for Natalie to not go home. Episode 4, zero confessionals. Episode 5, whatever. And it's not until episode 6 that she gets more of a focus, with her talking about how she feels bad for Gabby. But considering they had already been on a try for 3 episodes, and we had already gotten content about Gabby being on the bottom, I do find that to be not great at the end of the day. And then like Davey, she has a pretty quiet merge episode, only getting 1 confessional, and even that's kind of a nothing confessional there, even though she wins immunity. And her episode 8 is also pretty whatever. Episode 9, she does get more of a focus, where she does follow up on her promise to take out Dan in the post-swap, only for her to have her vote stolen, which I do find pretty funny there. And her relationship with Gabby does become a focus from that point on. And from that point on, her edit isn't terrible. She does have some good moments here and there, like during the Alec round, she talked about how as a doctor she wanted to save Alec, but realized that she couldn't save him, kind of like what she had to do as a doctor. And she does also get some strategic content, but by that point on, she wasn't really much of a contender considering how quiet her pre-merge had been. And it makes sense why she's eventually taken out at the final 5, considering she had already been propped up as a threat for the last few episodes. So again, makes sense why she gets taken out before the end, but still someone who was never really a contender. Next up, we have Kara, the final juror of the season, and I feel like Kara is pretty consistently in the middle of the pack for pretty much the entire season, which is bad considering she's never a contender, but at the same time, she never really has a massive downfall in the same way that other people have downturns in their edits. Her premiere is fine, where she does have her showmance with Dan being established, is portrayed mostly positively there. And while that starts to be targeted in episode 2, I feel like Dan is getting more of the negativity between the duo, while people like Kara talk about how it's difficult to be in alliance with Dan since he is making their bond too obvious. And we also see her aligning with people like Angelina and Natalia. So again, I feel like she does kind of balance out there. And her episode 3 is kind of just fine. She does get a confession about Jeremy being paranoid, but really nothing too remarkable there. But then we get to the swap, which is where things get a bit more interesting, where we do see Natalia trying to target Elizabeth because of Kara's bond with Elizabeth. And she is later blindsided at this vote, where she does vote with Natalia only to lose her there. Bad from a game front. And then while she's at the bottom afterwards, I do feel like she gets better content from the bottom compared to Gabby, where we do see her trying to throw Alec under the bus, talking about how Alec's flip was a bad move since it gave the Davis the numbers. But again, nothing to really propel her into top contention. We then get to the merge, where she does get some content about how the Goliaths are on the top and that Dan's the king of the castle, but then complains about Dan being paranoid and how even his good position is not good enough for him, which I do feel like also dunks on Dan to a degree, but still, she's able to have a consistent presence at the merge. Episode 8 is pretty quiet, though it's not that bad considering she does get blindsided there, losing John Hennigan, so I feel like the show is shielding her from that. And then she rebounds the following round, where she does turn on Dan, how she calls him an anchor for his game, and she does turn on him, which in a lot of ways reminds me of Kelly from 45, where even though this is technically bad from a game standpoint, considering how Dan does seem to be pretty loyal to her, I also feel like the show isn't necessarily portraying it as that negative of a move, and the fact that she does go through with this plan by splitting the vote on Dan and Angelina, it's a good look from her edit-wise. After that, she does continue in targeting Carl, talking about how Carl's making all these mistakes, and that later leads into her being part of the Carl blindside. And while I don't think there's a ton of negativity associated with Kara's edit for a lot of the season, I also feel like Nick and Mike are very blatant frontrunners by that point, to where she can never truly catch up, and she is eventually taken out at the final 4, obviously. But I feel like considering she gets a relatively consistent edit for a lot of the season and doesn't get that undermined across it, it does make sense why she makes a deep run and is kind of considered a threat to win, but obviously comes up short by the end of it. And now we've reached the runners-up, starting with Angelina. And Angelina's an interesting case here, considering she is one of the biggest characters on the season, and good on her for that. And I think edgically, she has a pretty interesting path across the season. Now, her premiere is kind of wonky, where there's definitely some good there, where she gets a confession on the intro, talking about how she's had this fairy tale life, and you later have her talking about how, like, the Goliaths are stacked and stuff. But then you also have some negativity where she talks about how only 15% of idols have been found by women and that she wants to find the idol, only for Dan to find it, which is a bit underwhelming there. But I do think episode 2 is better, where we do see her building the majority alliance of her, Kara, and Natalia, and they are able to pull in the likes of John, Dan, and Alec. And while she is actually the one to create that alliance, I still think she gets some credit in the edit for doing so. Episode 3 is also pretty good, where she does get the bulk of the credit for the Jeremy vote, where she is the one to pin the target on the Jeremy. So again, I do feel like early on, pre-swap, she does pretty well. But I think the swap is where we start to see some cracks, where we get to the Natalie boot, episode 5, where she ends up voting out Lyrsa, and obviously we have her asking for Natalie's jacket, which isn't the greatest look in the world, but not enough to really deter her chances. And it's not until the following episode that we actively see Lyrsa talking bad about Angelina, how she sees her as petty, and the fact that we're seeing Angelina being dunked on here is enough to drop her to number 7. But I think the merge episode fully cements her as having no chance of winning, where we get to the whole Elizabeth situation, where she tells Elizabeth that she's going home in an effort to get Elizabeth's jury vote. And obviously that's a terrible look for her. We do see her being targeted at that point, and we see the fallout of this decision, where from that point on, no one takes her seriously left in the game. We even get to the following episode where she is the decoy target due to her antics from the previous tribal. And I feel like that's the point of the season where she goes full Angelina. We do see her being this pretty big character, but along the way we get some negativity. And I think it's pretty clear by that point that she's not winning. We get to episode 8 where she begs Dan to use his idol on her, is able to do so. We then get to the following episode, episode 9, where she gets upset over not getting veggie burgers as her reward. We get to episode 10 where she's part of the whole rice negotiation. And again, I feel like Angela is a fantastic character during this post-merge, and even before the merge with the whole jacket situation. But I feel like the post-merge just really tanked her chances of winning, and she never is really able to recover from that point on, and it makes sense why she's towards the bottom of this ranking. But considering how big of a character she is, I feel like the show does a good enough job of explaining why she eventually loses at the end to the likes of Mike and Nick. Next up, we have Mike White, and kind of similar to Christian, I feel like Mike's edit was hard to reconcile, where on one hand, it was pretty obvious from early on he would be a major character on the season, but at the same time, he also exemplified this journey edit that we see a lot, where this person tends to be a major character, grows into a competent player, and is shown to be a power player, but is someone that very rarely wins the game by the end of it, as we saw with people like David Wright from Millennials vs. Gen X. I feel like Mike White very clearly fits that archetype. But despite that, I feel like it was kind of hard to ignore his edit for a lot of it, and I feel like it naturally placed him higher up on this power ranking. Now early on, he does have a rocky start where we do see him getting into trouble for idol hunting, and even then there's an argument that the reason he is getting so much screen time is because he's a celebrity that was on The Amazing Race and wrote School of Rock and all this stuff. But even then, I feel like by the end of the premiere, he does recognize that he got himself into a bad spot, and I feel like he does explain himself enough to where he isn't as low on the power ranking as what he could have been, even with his big premiere. But I feel like he really recovers in episode 2, where we see his bond with Jeremy and learning about the dance idol from Jeremy and how information is the advantage in the game and it's more powerful than the idol. So again, I feel like he gets a lot of propping up from that episode that really rebounds him to be number 3. Now he later drops to number 5 after episode 3, considering he does have to vote out Jeremy despite him having this bond with Jeremy. Though at the same time, he also explains that vote where he talks about how Jeremy kind of dug his own grave and that he kind of has no choice but to vote out Jeremy. So again, I feel like it kind of rectifies itself, but he recovers at the swap episode where we see him being in this pretty powerful position, and we do see him laying out how things are on the swap tribe. We also see him bonding with Nick, talking about how he's unpretentious and salt of the earth. And from that point on, he's in the top 2 the rest of the season, with it essentially being a battle between him and Nick for the top spot. And I feel like that's also where things get complicated, as I feel like both Nick and Mike have major issues with their edit that I'll be getting more with Nick in a moment. But I feel like for Mike, the big issue is the fact that this feels like a journey edit, where we saw someone like David Wright being in a similar spot to Mike for a lot of the game, only to be cut at the very end. And I feel like Mike had that major worry that despite him being this power player and despite him getting all this content, there's always this worry that he was going to be cut before the end, just like David Wright was. But even so, I feel like after the merge, especially after John Hennigan got taken out, I feel like Mike and Nick were by far the front runners, where I feel like it was pretty much going to be between one of those two. It was just a matter of which one. But even so, I feel like Nick overtook him in the power ranking after the John Hennigan vote for a few reasons. I feel like for one, the fact that Mike got so much credit for creating the Strike Force Alliance only for it to crumble right away was probably not the greatest look. And I feel like the Goliaths were clearly being set up to be the underdogs for the next couple of rounds because of this decision to not work with the Davids. I think also him being pretty quiet during the Gabby episode in episode 11, where really his only content was him suggesting they split the votes onto Gabby in case an idol was played, but really outside that he got pretty much nothing there. And I think with the overall worry about this being a journey edit to where he probably could have been cut at Final Four was also a big worry. Though I will also say that the fact that he got to the end at all is also a bit of a surprise, as again, I feel like with journey edits, you typically see that person not actually get the final tribal, but in this case, he actually did win the fire making challenge. He actually did get the final tribal and supposedly did have a shot at winning, only to kind of give up by the end. So I did find his edit as a whole to be pretty strange, but I feel like for a lot of reasons, he was very clearly a frontrunner by the end of it, but not the top contender. And finally, we have the winner of the season in Nick Wilson. And obviously say what you will about Nick nowadays, but I feel like Nick got a pretty interesting winner's edit here in the sense that he had a pretty baffling premiere. Now there is some good within this premiere. He does get a match chat for one, which is something that winners usually get in the modern day, but not always. But he also gets a confessional right after this match chat talking about his background, how he grew up poor and that he became a public defender. He also gets to set up his relationship with Christian and how he likes to name his alliances. So there's definitely some good there, but there's also plenty of bad where we actively see people like Carl talking badly about him, how he doesn't work around camp, and even with his tendency to name alliances, I could have very well seen that just being like this goofy thing that's not meant to be taken seriously. And there's even talk afterwards about how he could have been the first boot of his tribe had they actually gone the tribal. And while I think the end of his premiere isn't that bad, where he kind of recovers by opening up about his personal story and that he realizes that he has to be vulnerable in order to make bonds that he needs for the game, I do feel like that negativity in the middle was such a sour taste in my mouth that moving forward, it became hard to see him as a top contender, which is strange considering that moving forward, a lot of his content is really good. Where in episode 2, he talks about how he has new life in the game and that we see him continuing to build this bond with Christian, calling them JT and Steven. He names it the Mason-Dixon Alliance. He obviously is a key factor in the Jessica vote. Episode 3, we see him being pretty successful in tricking people like B and Davey into thinking that Gabby was the one that betrayed them, throwing her under the bus there. He also gets a very good swap episode where we see him bonding with Mike, naming them the rock stars. We see Mike talking pretty positively about Nick there, and then they eventually get their way in the Natalie boot the following episode. And then in episode 6, while he does technically not get his way and wanting to vote out Angelina for a lot of it, I still feel like his pre-merge outside the premiere is pretty spotless, and considering he's not overexposed and is mostly positive, I do feel like that kind of elevates him back up in the power rankings, but I do feel like that bad premiere was enough to where for a lot of the season, I was hesitant about having him at number 1. It was just kind of hard to find a place to insert him to number 1. And while his merge episode is good, where he gives his perspective on the Strike Force Alliance and being included within that, I feel like it's not until the John Hennigan blindside in episode 8 that I could confidently put him at number 1, as he is the main orchestrator of that. He is the one that narrates a lot of that. He is the one finds the vote steal and calls it the slingshot to take down the Goliath, kind of stealing Carl's spotlight there, and he is successful in that very round and using these advantages to take out John Hennigan. Following round takes out Dan. So again, all that's very good. And I feel like moving forward, he continues to be a strategic narrator where we constantly see his perspective and he very rarely gets undermined across that. Now I feel like episode 12 is a bit wonky where he does kind of get himself into trouble by his fake idol, how Davey wanted to target him, but even that's rectified by the end of it. And obviously while he's an underdog coming into the end game, we do see him winning those final few immunity challenges to get to the end and win. So I do feel like Nick's edit is pretty strong for the most part, and outside of that middle section of his premiere, I feel like Nick has a lot of what you would want out of a modern winner's edit. And while it took me a while to shake off that negativity within the premiere, I feel like by the time of the early merge, I feel like it was pretty hard to ignore that everything else was pretty perfect. And I feel like considering that Mike's journey edit felt less likely to come out on top by the end of it, I feel like Nick was a pretty safe bet to win by the end. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps out with the channel. Now I'm planning to do a player ranking for this season as well, so you can look forward to that. I'm on Patreon, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.